Hey guys, today we're going to be continuing our conversation and talking about Dan Dennett's Consciousness Explained. Some quick background info. So Dennett is alive today and writing and teaching. He's a contemporary American philosopher and he specializes in the philosophy of mind. Also, something to note that's going to be helpful for today, ultimately he comes down on the side of empiricism, at least in terms of method. And for that reason, he's functioning at this interesting intersection between philosophy and cognitive science. And I think you'll see that overlap today. So here's our opening question. Why is it that we're so enamored with this thing called consciousness? This has been something that we've been talking about literally for thousands of years. To people in ancient Greece, this was fascinating. To Descartes, this was fascinating. To everyone in between, this was fascinating. And to everyone after, this was fascinating. It's like we're still talking about this same thing after so many years. And that's pretty interesting. It seems like there's something really, really, really special about consciousness. But maybe there's not. Maybe our focus is just all wrong. Maybe we're right, but maybe we're wrong. And this is a kind of question we want to consider for today when we talk about Dennett. So to begin, on 21, Dennett says, human consciousness is just about the last surviving mystery. A mystery is a phenomenon that people don't know how to think about, yet. There have been other great mysteries. The mystery of the origin of the universe, the mystery of life and reproduction, the mystery of the design to be found in nature, the mysteries of time, space, and gravity. These were not just areas of scientific ignorance, but of utter bafflement and wonder. We do not yet have the final answers to any of the questions of cosmology and particle physics, molecular genetics, and evolutionary theory, but we do know how to think about them. The mysteries haven't vanished, but they have been tamed. They no longer overwhelm our efforts to think about the phenomena because now we know how to tell the misbegotten questions from the right questions. And even if we turn out to be dead wrong about some of the currently accepted answers, we know how to go about looking for better answers. Okay, so there are all these mysteries that exist, and human consciousness is the biggest one, perhaps. And Dennett defines a mystery as a phenomenon that we don't know how to think about yet. And that's the key. It's something we don't know how to explain. And not even that we don't know how to explain it, we don't know how to conceptualize it properly. But it's only a temporary state. See, a mystery doesn't stay a mystery forever unless you let it. And that's where Dennett's going to be going with this, because consciousness seems to be this thing that creates all this bafflement and wonder. But he says there are other mysteries. Right? There are mysteries about the origin of the universe, the origin of life, of reproduction, blah, 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 and all this stuff. And we kind of figured out the answers here. Even if we didn't figure out 100% of the answers, and even if the answers we've given aren't absolute, we at least know how to think about them, is Dennett's point, right? Like, we talk about the Big Bang, we talk about the evolution of single-celled organisms to more complex multi-celled organisms and complex systems and all that good stuff. Those things seemed like mysteries, but then we learned how to think about them. And he wants to say that something similar is happening with consciousness. He says, on 22, with consciousness, however, we are still in a terrible muddle. Consciousness stands alone today as a topic that often leaves even the most sophisticated thinkers tongue-tied and confused. And as with all the earlier mysteries, there are many who insist and hope that there will never be a demystification of consciousness. Pretty interesting. So while all those other mysteries got unmystified, consciousness is still a mystery. We still don't know how to properly explain or conceptualize it. It's like the last frontier, right? The final frontier. And he says it's because there are many who insist that there will never be a demystification, but also people that hope there won't be a demystification. And that's interesting because he seems to be bringing personal motive into the mix. He seems to be saying there's this element of desire that obscures people's objectivity and their rationality when they think about consciousness. And this results in our conceiving of consciousness as something much more mysterious than it actually is. Now, we haven't seen this kind of intellectual move being made yet, but let's see how it unfolds in Dennett. He says, mysteries are exciting, after all, part of what makes life fun. No one appreciates the spoil sport who reveals whodunit to the moviegoers waiting in line. Once the cat is out of the bag, you can never regain the state of delicious mystification that once enthralled you. So let the reader beware. If I succeed in my attempt to explain consciousness, those who read on will trade mystery for the rudiments of scientific knowledge of consciousness, not a fair trade for some tastes. Since some people view demystification as desecration, I expect them to view this book at the outset as an act of intellectual vandalism, an assault on the last sanctuary of humankind. But I would like to change their minds. So here's his explanation for this. So mysteries are exciting, right? Mysteries often are the things that keep us going, that keep us curious, that keep us asking questions, that keep us wanting more, that can give us meaning and motivation. But the problem with mysteries is once you have an explanation for the thing, there's no longer a mystery. And so it loses its magic, so to speak. And for some, the loss of that magic is the loss of the meaning, right? Is the loss of the motivation for the important stuff. And this is why demystification is often viewed as desecration, right? It's like violating, it's destroying, it's defiling something. And so what Dennett's doing in demystifying consciousness, or at least in attempting to do so, right, because we don't know if he's going to be successful, is something that from the get-go, many people are not going to think is possible. And even if it was possible, many people would still be resistant to his attempt. But he wants to change their mind. Let's go on. He says, how, though, might the demystification of consciousness be something to regret? That's an important question, right? He says, it might be like the loss of childhood innocence, which is definitely a loss, even if it is well recompensed. Consider what happens to love, for instance, when we become more sophisticated. We can understand how a knight in the age of chivalry would want to sacrifice his life for the honor of a princess he had never had so much as spoken to. This was especially thrilling idea to me when I was about 11 or 12, but it is not a state of mind into which an adult today can readily enter. People used to talk and think about love in ways that are now practically unavailable, except to children, and to those who can somehow suppress their adult knowledge. We all love to tell those we love that we love them, and to hear from them that we are loved. But as grown-ups, we are not quite as sure we know what this means as we once were when we were children and love was a simple thing. Okay, so the demystification of consciousness might be like the demystification of the world and life that happens when you move out of childhood and into adulthood, right? You start seeing imperfections, things start being fully quantified, things start seeming smaller, things seem less exciting. And that's definitely a really depressing thing. And so he thinks the reason why we latch on to this drive for mystery, for consciousness, is the same reason we lament the loss of childhood innocence and love. This one's interesting. So think of a time in your life where it was like the first time you really felt attracted romantically to someone. The first time you had love, quote unquote. That was probably something really unique and something that's going to stick with you forever. And that's because at the time it happened, it was like, whoa, this is crazy. I don't know how to think about it. It seems like I'm being taken into this whole other realm. It seems like this is so otherworldly and like an answer for all my problems and something to be optimistic about from here on out. And it like takes over your whole being. But if any of you have ever been in relationships after that, or long-term relationships, then you see that's not how it stays, right? It's not like this overwhelming, all-encompassing magical thing as it was in the beginning, as it was when you were younger. It becomes something more workable, something less glamorous sounding, a kind of effective partnership. Of course, there's still respect for one another, there's still like for one another, there's still love. It's just that we start to think of love in a different way. But looking back, sometimes we're still in awe of that like initial first love experience we had, right? And it's something we mourn the loss of. And so because we mourn the loss of that, we don't want to give up the last mystery, which is the mystery of consciousness. This is at least Dennett's argument. He says something similar is happening to consciousness. Today we talk about our conscious decisions and unconscious habits, about the conscious experiences we enjoy, in contrast to, say, automatic cash machines, that would be ATMs, which have no such experiences. But we are no longer quite sure we know what we mean when we say these things. While there are still thinkers who gamely hold out for consciousness being some one genuine precious thing, like love or like gold, a thing that is just obvious and very, very special, the suspicion is growing that this is an illusion. Perhaps the various phenomena that conspire to create the sense of a single mysterious phenomenon have no more ultimate or essential unity than the various phenomena that contribute to the sense that love is a simple thing. So there are still people who want consciousness to be like this gem, but he thinks that this is ultimately an illusion, and people are starting to realize, mostly in the scientific community, that this is an illusion. And the idea is that things that seem transcendent, things that seem irreducibly complex, aren't actually, right? They're often made of a collection of simple phenomena, and it's just a matter of figuring out what that combination is. So here's some questions we want to ask ourselves. One, can Dennett be right? Is consciousness not really as mysterious and as mystical as we thought it was? Is it really something simple and less glamorous? And is the reason that we're trying to push against this just because we're in denial? Because we want certain things to be true? Because we want to believe certain things? Pretty heavy claim. I don't know. Maybe he's right. But we have to settle some things first, right? What exactly is this mystery he keeps talking about? And where does it come from? Well, he gives us nice answers to these questions. He says, what then is the mystery? On page 25. What could be more obvious or certain to each of us than that he or she is a conscious subject of experience, an enjoyer of perceptions and sensations, a sufferer of pain, an entertainer of ideas, and a conscious deliberator? That seems undeniable. But what in the world can consciousness itself be? How can living physical bodies in the physical world produce such phenomena? That's the mystery. How can living physical things in the physical world produce a phenomena like conscious experiences that seem non-physical? How do all these seemingly mundane things produce something so elusive? Right, so captivating, so magical. That is the mystery. He says, let's see what happens when we take this undeniably tempting route. First, I want you to perform a simple experiment. It involves closing your eyes, imagining something, and then once you have formed your mental image and checked it out carefully, answering some questions below. Do not read the questions until after you have followed this instruction. Here he says, when you close your eyes, imagine in as much detail as possible a purple cow. So seriously, do that right now. Close your eyes and imagine a cow, but imagine that the cow is purple. Okay, you got it? Open your eyes. Now let's do a second exercise. Close your eyes and imagine in as much detail as possible a yellow cow. Okay, can you do that? Now here's the question. What is the difference between imagining a purple cow and imagining a yellow cow? Really think about that question. Maybe the answer is obvious. That's okay. because the answer is going to be an obvious one. But there's something telling about that answer. And he says on 28, the answer is obvious. The first imagined cow is purple, and the second is yellow. There might be other differences, but that's the essential one. The trouble is that since these cows are just imagined cows, rather than real cows or painted pictures of cows on canvas or cow shapes on a color television screen, it is hard to see what could be purple in the first instance and yellow in the second. Nothing roughly cow-shaped in your brain or in your eyeball turns purple in one case and yellow in the other. And even if it did, this would not much help, since it's pitch black inside your skull, and besides, you haven't any eyes in there to see colors with. Okay, so the answer is obviously, okay, the first cow is purple, second cow is yellow. But how is that possible? Because colors refer to physical things. Colors refer to stuff. In order to have color, you have to have stuff that has the color, right? But there isn't any physical stuff happening in your mind. Like what turns purple? It's not like parts of your brain are turning purple or yellow. And in addition, you need eyes. But there are no eyes inside your brain. So like how are things inside your mind turning different colors? Similarly, you need light, right? You can't have color without light, and there's no light happening inside your mind. And again, you might be tempted to say, well, it's happening inside my brain, but if we open up your brain, I'm not going to see anything, right? The example I always give in class is if you imagine right now that it's a summer day and you have this like beautiful ice cream sandwich, and I say, where is it? And you say, oh, it's in my head. That's not true. Because if I open your head, I'm not going to see that in there. That's the mystery. It's like, how are we imagining things that don't happen in space? How are we imagining things that aren't actually things with physical properties, right? That aren't having light reflected off of them, that aren't having color? These are the interesting questions. To continue, he says, what is brown when you imagine a brown cow? Not the event in the brain the scientists have calibrated with your experiencing of brown. The type and location of the neurons involved, their connections with other parts of the brain, the frequency or amplitude of activity, the neurotransmitter chemicals released, none of those properties is the very property of the cow in your imagination. And since you did imagine a cow, you're not lying, the scientists even confirmed that, an imagined cow came into existence at that time. Something somewhere must have had those properties at that time. The imagined cow must be rendered not in the medium of brain stuff, but in the medium of mind stuff. What else could it be? And this is the question, right? What is brown when you imagine a brown cow? Like, where is that happening? That's really weird. And it doesn't have to be a cow. Like, I don't want you to get connected to this specific thought experiment. You could do it with anything. Like, imagine a green sandwich. Now imagine a yellow sandwich. Like, where's the sandwich? Where's the greenness? Where's the yellowness? It's like nowhere you could touch. It's nowhere in physical space outside of you. So that's pretty weird. And if we measured the quantifiable events happening inside your brain, like the neurons involved and the activity happening between each neuron, none of those things is the thing you imagine when you imagine the cow or the sandwich or whatever it is. And none of those have colors, right? They're not changing depending on what you're thinking in that respect. So this is the point, is that you do this thought experiment and you figure, oh, so the imagined things, the stuff happening up there must not be in the brain, but it must be the mind. And so you think there's this distinction between the mind and the brain. And the brain is the physical stuff happening within your skull, and the mind is the stuff that is maybe caused by or related to that thing, but ultimately is separate, is not just contained within your skull. So we kind of invent, Dennett thinks, mind stuff. And mind stuff isn't brain stuff. Mind stuff isn't physical stuff. It's not matter. He says mind stuff then must be what dreams are made of. and it apparently has some remarkable properties. One of these we have already noticed in passing, but is extremely resistant to definition. At a first pass, let us say that mind stuff always has a witness. The trouble with brain events, we noticed, is that no matter how closely they match the events in our streams of consciousness, they apparently have one fatal drawback. There's nobody in there watching them. Events in your brain, just like events that happen in your stomach or in your liver, are not normally witnessed by anyone. Nor does it make any difference to how they happen, whether they occur witnessed or unwitnessed. Events in consciousness, on the other hand, are by definition witnessed. They're experienced by an experiencer, and their being thus experienced is what makes them what they are, conscious events. An experienced event cannot just happen on its own hook, it seems. It must be somebody's experience. For a thought to happen, someone, some mind, must think it. And for a pain to happen, someone must feel it. And for a purple cow to burst into existence in imagination, someone must imagine it. So, okay, here's a defining characteristic of the supposed mind stuff that we're speculating about. It always has a witness. There's always watching happening. It's never just a thing. It's like someone witnessing the thing. It's someone experiencing the thing. That's his point. So, for example, if you go back to the cow example or the sandwich example, when you imagine a cow, it's not just a cow. It's you imagining a cow, right? You're watching the imagined cow. You're watching the imagined sandwich. So there's kind of like he'll use the word theater, the Cartesian theater happening. It's not just like something is happening event-wise. It's like you're sitting in front of this movie screen and the events are happening in front of you on that movie screen. This witness is actually what we often identify with the concept of self that he's going to get into in a little bit. So the events in consciousness are by definition witnessed. But there's a problem. There's a problem. He says, the trouble with brains, it seems, is that when you look in them, you discover that there's nobody home. No part of the brain is the thinker that does the thinking or the feeler that does the feeling. And the whole brain appears to be no better a candidate for that special role. So the idea is, okay, you have this thing called mind stuff, maybe. And this mind stuff seems to be defined by its being experienced. And we typically think that this mind stuff is happening in the brain. However, when you look at the brain, nobody's home. There's no self in there. There's no experiencer in there. There's no one watching stuff happen. It's just a bunch of mush with physical properties. It's just a bunch of chemicals happening back and forth. So that's really weird, because it seems like the brain is the epicenter of the mind, whatever you want to call it, the locus, and yet the mind has properties that the brain does not, and vice versa. And this is going to be one of the problems for dualism, right? Is that there's no evidence we can look at that there is such a thing as an experiencer. But let's recap first. So, idea number one, consciousness is not the mysterious thing that we think it is. Dennett thinks instead it can be demystified by science, but we are resistant to these methods. Right? It seems like consciousness is non-physical. It really seems like there exists this thing called mind stuff that is separate from the brain. In other words, it seems like dualism is true, but it's not. Recall dualism. We've been talking about this since at least we did Descartes. Remember, dualism is the metaphysical narrative that reality is composed of two substances, right? Two different types of things. One of them is physical stuff, right? Is matter or material and energy and all that good stuff. And the other stuff is mental, right? Non-material things. And Descartes has thought that was true. Locke, in some respect, thought that was true. A lot of people think that's true. Probably most people think that's true, as we've been saying. But Dennett wants to say dualism is not true, even though it seems like it is. But the question we want to ask ourselves is why. But before we get to that question, I apologize because my downstairs neighbor, if you can't hear, is playing some generic, funny electronic dance music beat. Okay, so we're going to move on from that. But he gives us an answer, right? Dennett says on 33 and 34, the standard objection to dualism was all too familiar to Descartes himself in the 17th century, and it is fair to say that neither he nor any subsequent dualist has ever overcome it convincingly. If mind and body are distinct things or substances, they nevertheless must interact. The bodily sense organs via the brain must inform the mind, must send to it or present it with perceptions or ideas or data of some sort, and then the mind, having thought things over, must direct the body in appropriate action, including speech. Okay, so if the mind and the body are distinct, right? If the mind and the brain are not the same thing, if there's mental stuff and then there's physical stuff, if they exist separately, they need to interact, right? No one denies that. Even if you're someone who believes that consciousness is not the same exact thing as your brain, you do believe they interact. You believe that the brain has some role in consciousness. You believe that consciousness interacts with the brain, right? And the idea is like if you have a thought, like I'm going to move my arm, it's like you have the thought and then you move your arm. So even if your consciousness isn't the same thing as your brain or your arm, it's your consciousness that's telling you to move the brain of the arm, to enact a physical change, in other words. But there's a super, super, super interesting problem with this idea of interaction between the two distinct substances. So on page 35, Dennett says, just as one would expect, ingenious technical exemptions based on sophisticated readings of the relevant physics have been explored and expounded, but without attracting many conversations. Dualism's embarrassment here is really simpler than the citation of presumed laws of physics suggests. It is the same incoherence that children notice, but tolerate happily in fantasy, in such fare as Casper the Friendly Ghost. How can Casper both glide through walls and grab a falling towel? Think about that. How can mind stuff both elude all physical measurement and control the body? A ghost in the machine is of no help in our theories unless it is a ghost that can move things around, like a noisy poltergeist who can tip over a lamp or slam a door. But anything that can move a physical thing is itself a physical thing. So imagine, I don't know if you guys know what this is. This may be like too old, but Casper the Friendly Ghost was this cartoon character, right? And he was a ghost and people were scared of him, but like he was just a nice boy. And the idea was that sometimes he would behave like a ghost, like, oh, I can float through walls, I can go through things, right? You could throw something at me and it goes through me. But just when it was convenient, like, oh, I could grab something if you dropped it. So there's this weird dual role that Casper the ghost takes on where it's like, oh, I could behave like a non-physical ghost, but I could also enact physical change. And when kids watch this, they don't think about this, right? They just suspend the disbelief. There's no contradiction to them. But Dennett is saying as a rational adult, this shouldn't make sense to you, right? If something is non-physical, then it can't cause physical changes. And if the thing can move a physical thing, then it is itself a physical thing. So consciousness, if it's really non-physical, wouldn't be able to cause physical changes in the way that it does. Well, that it supposedly does according to us. And if consciousness is not physical, well, then it's not physical and dualism is not true. And he has this funny comic. And then he concludes, he says, on 38, this fundamentally anti-scientific stance of dualism is, to my mind, its most disqualifying feature and is the reason why in this book I adopt the apparently dogmatic rule that dualism is to be avoided at all costs. It is not that I think I can give a knockdown proof that dualism in all of its forms is false or incoherent, but that given the way dualism wallows in mystery, accepting dualism is giving up. So there it is. He thinks at the end of the day, dualism is anti-scientific. Now that in itself is it's not a critique. It's only a critique if you think that philosophy needs to be in line with science. And Dennett is someone that thinks that, right? He thinks that if your philosophy is anti-scientific, then it is not good, right? Then it is dangerous and it is wrong. And as a result, he thinks that dualism is to be avoided at all costs, right? Accepting dualism for Dennett is like giving up. And if you look at that funny cartoon, you see some guy doing like an interesting math equation, and there's 3 steps. There's the first step, and then there's the third step of equations. And in the middle, he just writes, then a miracle occurs. That's kind of what dualists do. That's kind of what Descartes and Cartesians are doing. They're like, okay, there's this mental stuff, and then there's this physical stuff, and then like, oh, but how do they interact? It just does. Some kind of miracle happens. We don't know what it is. Dennett doesn't like that, right? Dennett's like the guy saying the quote at the bottom of that cartoon. I think you should be more explicit here in step 2. So at the end of the day, we have these critiques of dualism, right? One, the problem is that dualism posits some non-physical thing like a self, but there is no empirical evidence of a self or any other type of non-physical experiencer. And even Skinner thought this, right? So in some sense, Dennett is adopting at a base level the same metaphysical stance that Skinner was, although they disagree when it comes to free will, but that's another issue. And the second point is that if non-physical substance exists, as dualism suggests, it can interact with physical substance. So it couldn't do the thing that dualists say it does. And then if non-physical substance doesn't exist, then consciousness is non-physical, right? So either way, dualism doesn't work. And here are some final questions that we might want to ponder after reading Dennett. So if Dennett is right, where do we go from here? How do we continue thinking about consciousness? Does this mean we have to give up certain lines of argument? Do we have to pursue certain lines of argument more? What does this mean for our scientific inquiry or our philosophical inquiry? Like, how do we proceed? Another question, are there ways of making dualistic arguments that avoid the problems Dennett highlights? In other words, is Dennett's critique of certain types of dualism, but not all? Or is he making a kind of straw man of dualistic arguments? I don't know. And lastly, are there any responses to Dennett? Are there any defenses of dualism? Are there any contemporary arguments one could give against Dennett and save dualism? I don't know. That's something we're going to be looking at when we talk about Chalmers. But otherwise, that's it for today, guys. I'll see you around.